Hey everybody. Um, this week I'd like to kind of take a little bit of time to reflect on uh, the theology of sermon writing. Some of you that aren't preachers are probably going like, "Oh, geez, like this is gonna be boring." No. It's more just me kind of wanting to reflect on the process that I go through whenever I'm writing a sermon. Typically, I mean, I took all the classes in the preaching, and I learned all of the tricks of homiletics is the fancy word for it. With dealing with a dominant thought, the one sentence or that summarizes your whole sermon, which I remember one of my professors used to refer to it as the sermon in a sentence. And I think those are great. The big idea of your sermon being summarized in one clear sentence. I struggle with that. Big time. As a matter of fact, me and one of my friends recently were just talking about sermon writing, and he is fantastic at writing a sermon in a sentence. And man, I just struggle. And then he told me this. He goes, "Well, Shane, it's because you're not actually teaching them one thing. You're engaging with them in an experience. You're giving them not just an image, but an entire story to be embraced by." And I was like, okay, now wait a minute. Why is it that I have both accidentally, but over the years, I think intentionally, crafted my sermon writing style to be more narrative in nature? It's not that I tell stories a lot. It's that I think I've actually embraced elements of storytelling in the sermon writing itself. Here's what I mean by that. Every good story has tension. A lot of my thinking on this comes from the book by Eugene Lowry called The Homiletical Plot. And he points out, he says, listen, whenever you're writing a sermon, why don't you stop and just remember the fact that we are storied beings. Now, this isn't exactly what he says. This is my paraphrase on how I remember it. But we're storied beings. We're saturated in story. Hollywood makes billions of dollars a year off the fact that we love stories. One of the key sermon tactics is to, if people are falling asleep, tell them a story. Because we always perk up. Like if I said, her name was Elizabeth. And Elizabeth was struggling with addiction. And immediately, your posture changes. You lean in a little bit more. Why? Because there's something about a name and a story that draws us in. And every story is driven by a problem. I mean, this is plot. Plot is in part is a study of the conflict. And every good story, every good sitcom has a problem at its core that we are drawn into because we want to know how it will be resolved. Whenever I begin writing a sermon, I begin by asking myself this question. When I came to that realization, whatever that may be, what was the path I walked? Where did I begin? Because typically it begins with me wrestling with a problem, with a question. But what I really want to do is I want to try to figure out a way to put on the flesh of the people that are sitting in the audience to figure out what it is they are wrestling with. And then hopefully my story and their struggles will align and eventually lead us to Jesus. Here's really the theology behind my sermon writing, and the fact that I center it on narrative, that I center it on drawing them into an experience. The theology behind it is Philippians 2. Chapter 2, verse 6. Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage, something to be grasped. No. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. You see, empathy is different than sympathy. Sympathy is when you feel bad for someone. You hear their struggles, you see what the pain they're going through, and you feel bad for them. And then you show them compassion, or that you're sharing in their sufferings by giving them sympathy, feeling sorry for them. Empathy is different. As a matter of fact, if you look up empathy in the English dictionary, it even says empathy is feeling the experiences or engaging the feelings of another person from inside of the flesh of that other person. It is embodying that other person, experiencing what they experience through their eyes of the person themselves. Empathy is much different than sympathy. Sympathy feels bad for the person. Empathy, in some sense, puts on the flesh of that person, which is very Christ-like. And that's what Christ did for us. We don't have a God that sat outside of our story and waited for the story to get better, or even just threw a command out to us that we're enmeshed in the story so that just bam, like a fairy godmother, everything is now better. No, instead we have a God that showed us an example of entering into our story so that our experiences can be united with His. And I think that's the very heart of what sermon writing should be. I think that's the very heart of what service should be. I think that's the very heart of the way in which we can engage our community. I mean, if we were better at empathy, maybe Christians wouldn't be so vicious with what it is that we disagree with culture about. It reminds me of Revelation 2 with Ephesus. I mean, do we remember where we were and the mess we were in whenever Christ found us? Because if we could picture that, maybe we would have more compassion for the people that we find in the same situations that we're in. Empathy. It is a tool, a discipline to look beyond yourself, to take on the flesh of another person so that instead of arguing with them, you can actually see the problem from their eyes. I think sermons should be the same way. It's not that having a dominant thought is bad. I'm not even making a suggestion that people that do that don't even do the empathy I'm talking about. What I'm saying is what's behind the method of my preaching is story. Ultimately, it's empathy. Triumphantly, it's the incarnation of Christ. Those are my thoughts for this week. I love you guys. I'll see you next week.